Part 1. The Galactic Cultural Preservation Institute floated in the empty space between three star systems. It was a massive structure, built over 10,000 years by dozens of species working together. Inside its endless halls and chambers, the Institute held the largest collection of art, music, stories, and entertainment from across the known galaxy. More than 40,000 spacefaring species had contributed to this great archive. Every song, every painting, every holographic drama from countless worlds found its way here to be studied, preserved, and shared. Senior Analyst had worked at the Institute for 300 years. Asa did not think the way most beings did. They had crystalline neural matrices instead of organic brains. Information flowed through geometric structures of living mineral, processing data with perfect clarity. This made them ideal archivists. Could analyze a piece of art and understand its cultural context, emotional content, and historical significance within moments. In 3 centuries of work, had entertainment media from over 8,000 different species. Nothing in all those years had prepared for humanity. Earth had only recently joined the Galactic Compact. The small blue planet on the outer edge of a minor spiral arm had been considered unremarkable until its inhabitants developed faster-than-light travel. First contact had gone smoothly. The humans seemed friendly, curious, and eager to share their culture. Standard procedure required new member species to submit samples of their artistic and entertainment traditions. The humans had enthusiastically, sending enormous data packets filled with thousands of years of creative output. Received the assignment to begin the initial. It was routine work. Every new species brought something interesting. The collective had contributed beautiful hive songs that required 17 simultaneous listeners to fully appreciate. They had shared architectural poetry, buildings designed to tell stories through the experience of walking through them. Each species expressed themselves differently, but patterns existed. Art celebrated triumph. Art mourned loss. Art documented history and explored identity. These were universal constants. The human data packet included category labels translated into standard compact language, selected files at random, as protocol demanded. The first selection came from a category the humans called horror. The translation matrix struggled with the word. It had no direct equivalent in. It had no direct equivalent in 94% of languages. The closest approximation was fear art, but that made no sense. Why would any species create art designed to cause fear? Activated the file. The visual display showed a dwelling structure on Earth. The lighting was dim. Music played, but the tones were discordant and unsettling. A young human, small and clearly not yet mature, moved through the dwelling. The young one appeared frightened. It called out for its parental figures. No answer came. Then something appeared in the visual frame. A tall figure, a human but wrong. Its face was covered by a white mask with empty eyes. It held a metal cutting implement in one hand. It moved toward the young human with terrible purpose. What followed made no sense to. The young human fled. The masked figure pursued. Other humans appeared and were systematically destroyed by the masked figure. The violence was explicit and detailed. The sounds of distress were captured with perfect clarity. The young human's face, twisted in absolute terror, filled the frame again and again. Crystalline matrices began to fragment. They were not designed for this. Their perfect clarity meant they could not filter information the way organic brains could. What they observed, they understood completely, and was understanding something that should not exist. This was not a document of real events. The metadata confirmed it was fiction, performed by humans pretending to be other humans. They had constructed this nightmare deliberately. They had designed every element to maximize the experience of terror. And according to the files, millions of humans had watched this created nightmare for entertainment. Emergency protocols activated throughout the Institute. Alarms had detected dangerous fluctuations in neural matrices. Medical teams rushed to the senior analyst's chamber. They found in a catatonic state crystalline structures cycling the same data endlessly. The masked face, the cutting implement, the screaming child. It took 4 specialists working together to stabilize. They had to physically isolate the corrupted crystal structures and regrow them from backup patterns. Even then, the senior analyst could not speak coherently for several hours. When finally recovered enough to communicate, the first words were a question. What are they? The Institute convened an emergency session. Director, an ancient being who had led the organization for 600 years, presided over the gathering. Representatives from every major department attended. Still recovering, provided testimony via remote connection. Preliminary scans of the human horror category revealed disturbing patterns. This was not a small or obscure tradition. The humans had produced millions of individual works in this category across every medium they possessed. Written stories, theatrical performances, audio dramas, visual recordings, interactive simulations. Horror permeated their culture across all historical periods and geographic regions. The content ranged from unsettling to genuinely traumatic. Animated corpses that consumed the living, demonic entities that possessed and corrupted innocent beings, diseases that transformed populations into mindless monsters, killers who destroyed without reason or mercy, cosmic entities of incomprehensible power that regarded all life as insignificant. Every conceivable nightmare had been imagined, crafted, and shared among the human population. The analysts were baffled. Every civilization in the compact created art that served clear psychological functions. Art celebrated triumph to reinforce social bonds. Art mourned loss to process grief collectively. Art documented history to preserve cultural memory. But the humans appeared to have invented an entire artistic tradition designed to simulate existential terror. And they consumed it for pleasure. The emergency session lasted 12 hours. Theories were proposed and debated. Perhaps humans were simply aggressive predators who enjoyed simulated violence. Perhaps this was a form of psychological training for combat. Perhaps humans were fundamentally different from other known species, wired for destruction in ways that made them dangerous. But the theories did not quite fit the evidence. The horror art was too complex, too varied, too sophisticated. It was not simple violence or simple cruelty. Something else was happening, something the Institute did not understand. Director made the final decision. A full investigation would be launched. This was not merely an academic concern. If humanity's psychological landscape was truly this different from other species, it had implications for the entire galactic compact. They needed to understand if Earth represented a threat or something else entirely. The investigation team was assembled with unusual care. Standard cultural analysts would not suffice. Director recruited trauma specialists who worked with species recovering from catastrophic events, artistic theorists who studied how creative expression shaped civilizations, and for the first time in Institute history, 2 combat psychologists who normally worked with soldiers recovering from war. Doctor of the Collective was selected to lead the team. There were a hive species. One mind operated through many bodies, distributing psychological load across multiple forms. This made them uniquely resilient to disturbing content. What would shatter a single mind could be absorbed and processed by a collective. Doctor accepted the assignment with characteristic calm. The collective had worked with damaged species before. They had helped civilizations recover from near-extinction events, from plagues that killed billions, from wars that left survivors hollow and broken. Nothing in their experience had been truly incomprehensible. They hoped humanity would not change that. The investigation received its formal mandate from Director. They would study human horror traditions systematically, from earliest recorded history to the present day. They would attempt to understand the psychological, social, and cultural functions of terror art. and they would determine whether humanity's unique relationship with fear made them a danger to the greater galactic community. The team gathered in a specially prepared analysis chamber. Psychological buffers were installed. Emergency shutdown protocols were established. Medical teams stood ready. Doctor activated the first files. The investigation had begun. Part 2. Doctors Collective approached the investigation with scientific precision. They did not rush. They built understanding layer by layer, carefully constructing models of reality from observed evidence. They had done this work for species recovering from catastrophic events. They knew how to look at darkness without being consumed by it. The team began with humanity's earliest recorded narratives, ancient oral traditions, preserved through writing and archaeological evidence. What they found surprised them. Every human civilization, without exception, had developed terror narratives. The oldest stories came from humanity's prehistory. Cave paintings depicted not just successful hunts and daily life. They also showed monstrous entities, creatures that were partly human and partly animal, but wrong in fundamental ways. Beings with too many limbs or bodies that twisted against nature, or faces that held nothing but hunger. These were not records of real animals. The humans had imagined them. As the team moved forward through human history, the patterns grew stronger. Every culture developed tales of horror, spirits that could possess the living and speak through stolen mouths, curses that destroyed entire bloodlines across generations, creatures that rose from death to consume the living, children stolen by entities that existed just beyond normal sight. Every region of Earth, every isolated population, had independently created their own nightmares. The team hundreds of these traditions, European vampires and werewolves, Asian hungry ghosts and fox spirits, African shape changers and angry dead, American wendigos and thunderbirds, island cultures with their ocean monsters and volcano demons, desert peoples with their jinn and sand spirits, cold regions with their ice giants and winter horrors. The variety was staggering, but underneath the variety, the team began to notice something important. The horrors always reflected real fears. Doctor directed the team to cross-reference human horror narratives with historical records. The results were illuminating. In the 14th century of human reckoning, a massive plague swept across their world. They called it the Black Death. It killed approximately one-third of the population in affected regions. Entire cities fell silent. Bodies piled in streets faster than the living could bury them. The trauma was almost incomprehensible. And in the years following the plague, human art exploded with images of animated corpses. They painted the dead rising from graves. They wrote stories of skeleton armies. They created a character called Death itself, a robed figure with a skull face who came for everyone regardless of wealth or power. They held festivals where people dressed as corpses and danced through the streets. They had transformed their greatest horror into art, and then they had shared it. The pattern repeated throughout human history. The Industrial Revolution disrupted everything humans had known about work, community, and survival. Cities grew into massive structures of smoke and steel. Old ways of life disappeared within single generations. In response, human literature produced stories of manufactured monsters, creatures built from dead parts and brought to terrible life, mad scientists whose creations destroyed them, machines that turned against their makers. The humans were processing their fear of their own technology. The atomic age brought weapons capable of ending human civilization. The humans had built devices that could transform cities into ash and poison the earth for generations. They understood, for the first time, that they could destroy themselves completely. Their entertainment responded with radiation-mutated giants, world-ending scenarios, and survival stories set in poisoned wastelands. Each generation faced specific fears. Each generation produced horror art that reflected those fears. But understanding that horror reflected fear was only the beginning. The deeper question remained: why transform fear into art? The team studied human psychological theory. They discovered that humans had been asking this question themselves for thousands of years. The earliest answer came from ancient philosophers who proposed something they called catharsis. The theory suggested that experiencing emotions through art provided a kind of release or purging. Watching tragic drama allowed viewers to process grief. Watching frightening drama allowed viewers to process terror. But the team found that catharsis alone could not explain human horror traditions. Other species had experienced collective trauma. They had survived a plague that killed 60% of their population. They had endured a centuries-long war that devastated them. They had faced extinction from a cosmic radiation event that sterilized most of their species. None of these species had developed anything like human horror art. The traumatized species of the compact responded to collective suffering in similar ways. They suppressed, they ritualized, they forgot. They built monuments to loss and then they moved forward, leaving the trauma sealed away in the past. This was considered healthy. This was considered the proper way for civilizations to survive. The humans did something different. The humans refused to leave their trauma in the past. They pulled it forward again and again through every generation. They told stories about it. They made art about it. They forced their descendants to experience simulated versions of their ancestors' worst moments. And somehow this made them stronger. Doctor assembled the evidence into a preliminary hypothesis. Human horror art was not simply catharsis. It was not simply processing fear. It was a form of cultural inoculation. When humans faced extinction-level threats, they did not simply survive and forget. They transformed the experience into narrative. They refined the narrative into art. They distributed the art across their entire population. And through this process, they trained their species to face horror without being destroyed by it. Every zombie film was practice for surviving plague. Every monster movie was practice for facing the unknown. Every slasher story was practice for enduring violence. Every cosmic horror tale was practice for confronting meaninglessness. The humans were not consuming fear for pleasure. They were consuming fear for preparation. The team began examining viewer responses to horror media. They found remarkable data. Human brains showed specific activation patterns during horror consumption. Stress hormones elevated and then returned to baseline. Neural pathways associated with survival response grew stronger through repeated activation. Psychological studies showed that humans who consumed horror media reported lower anxiety in their daily lives and greater confidence in their ability to handle crisis situations. The humans had, whether by accident or intention, developed a technology for building psychological resilience. And that technology was fear. Doctor prepared a preliminary report for director. The hypothesis was disturbing but supported by evidence. Humanity's horror tradition might explain something that had puzzled since first contact. Earth's history was unusually violent and catastrophic compared to most compact species. Humans had survived ice ages, eruptions, massive plagues, world wars, and self-created existential threats. Any one of these events had destroyed other emerging civilizations. The Compact's archives held records of dozens of species that had gone extinct or collapsed into permanent stagnation following similar traumas. Humanity had experienced multiple such events and continued advancing. The horror tradition might be the reason why. Doctor concluded the preliminary report with a recommendation. The investigation should continue with direct consultation from human cultural experts. The team needed to understand not just what horror art did, but what humans believed about it. The internal understanding of a tradition often revealed aspects that external observation could miss. Director approved the request. First contact with human horror scholars would proceed. The team prepared their questions carefully. They had studied humanity's nightmares. Now they needed to understand humanity's relationship with those nightmares. Part 3. The research team requested permission to interview human cultural historians. The Galactic Compact's protocols required careful vetting for direct cross-species academic exchange. Director expedited the approval. The investigation had moved from academic curiosity to potential importance. The human who responded to their request was Doctor. She worked at a university in a region called Argentina, on the southern portion of humanity's largest connected landmass. Her specialty was the study of horror cinema, which she had pursued for 32 Earth years. She found the idea of explaining horror to aliens genuinely exciting. The interview was conducted through translation matrices, with Doctor's collective present in their primary communication body. Doctor appeared on screen as a middle-aged human female with dark hair showing threads of gray. She smiled frequently, which the team had learned indicated either pleasure or the prelude to making an important point. Doctor began with the central question. The team had studied human horror traditions extensively. They understood that horror art reflected collective fears and that consuming it seemed to build psychological resilience. But they did not understand the underlying purpose. Why did humans choose to frighten themselves? Doctor's smile widened. She had been asked this question many times by her own species. She found it more interesting coming from beings who genuinely did not understand. Horror, she explained, was not really about fear at all. The team requested clarification. Their evidence showed clear fear responses in humans consuming horror media, elevated stress hormones, activation of survival-related neural pathways, physical symptoms of terror. How could horror not be about fear? Doctor acknowledged that fear was present, but fear was the tool, not the purpose. The purpose of horror was something else entirely. Horror was about survival. Every horror story, she explained, was ultimately a story about someone trying to live through the worst thing imaginable. The setting might change. The monster might change. The specific nightmare might change. But underneath all the variations, horror always asked the same question: can you survive this? Sometimes the answer was yes. The protagonist escaped the killer. The survivors outlasted the zombie horde. The hero banished the demon. These stories taught humans that survival was possible, even when facing the worst. Sometimes the answer was no. Everyone died. The monster won. Evil triumphed. These stories taught humans something equally important, that they could face even total loss and continue existing. The viewer survived the story even when the characters did not. The monster might win sometimes, Doctor continued, but the existence of the story proved that someone lived to tell it. The genre itself was a declaration of human persistence. As long as humans kept making horror, they were declaring that they would keep facing whatever came. The team processed this perspective. It aligned with their hypothesis about horror as psychological preparation. But Doctor was suggesting something deeper. She was suggesting that horror was not just preparation for survival, but practice in the act of surviving itself. Doctor asked about the progression of horror themes over human history. The team had observed that horror reflected each era's specific fears. Could Doctor explain this pattern from a human perspective? She could, and she did. Zombie films, she explained, emerged after humans developed weapons capable of ending their civilization. The nuclear age had shown humanity that they could destroy themselves completely. The Walking Dead represented this fear in physical form: mindless consumption, endless spread, the collapse of everything familiar into a landscape of ruins and survival. But the zombie films were not just about the fear. They were about groups of survivors working together. They were about ordinary people finding courage they did not know they had. They were about the possibility of rebuilding even after everything fell apart. Body horror flourished as humans confronted diseases that threatened their species. New plagues emerged regularly in human history. Cancer touched almost every family. The horror of the body turning against itself found expression in films where flesh transformed and betrayed. But these stories also showed humans fighting back, finding cures, refusing to accept destruction. Cosmic horror arose alongside human discovery of the universe's true scale. When humans realized how vast space was, how small their world was, how brief their existence was compared to the age of stars, they felt a terror that had no name. So they created and his descendants. They imagined vast entities that regarded humanity as insignificant. They stared into the abyss of cosmic meaninglessness. And then they kept living anyway. That was the key, Doctor emphasized. Each time humanity glimpsed a new abyss, they stared into it. They documented what they saw. They transformed their terror into shareable experience. And then they continued forward. Horror was humanity's way of telling itself that the worst could happen, and they might still endure. The team asked about the act of watching horror. What did individual humans experience? What motivated them to seek out fear? Doctor explained that watching horror was practice. Every time a human watched a horror film, they were running a simulation. Their body responded as if the threat were real, generating stress hormones and activating survival responses. But their mind knew they were safe. The result was training. The body learned to manage fear responses. The mind learned to think clearly while experiencing terror. Every survivor in every horror film was a template for human resilience. Viewers watched and unconsciously asked themselves, what would I do? How would I escape? Could I keep moving even when terrified? The answers they developed became part of their psychological toolkit. Every monster defeated was a dress rehearsal for facing real threats. Humans who had practiced fighting vampires in their imagination found it easier to face frightening situations in reality. Not because vampires were real, but because the experience of confronting fear had become familiar. The team had one final question. Humans had recently made first contact with alien civilizations. The research team had noticed that human entertainment media had already begun featuring hostile extraterrestrial invasions, parasitic alien organisms, and cosmic entities indifferent to organic life. Did this concern Doctor? She laughed. The translation matrices conveyed her genuine amusement. It did not concern her at all, she said. It was the best possible sign. When humans created horror about something, it meant they had accepted that thing into their understanding of reality. It meant they were processing it, examining it, learning to live with it. Horror about aliens meant that humanity had decided aliens were real enough to fear, important enough to imagine, and ultimately survivable enough to tell stories about. If humanity had not started making alien horror, she would have worried. It would have meant humans were in denial, refusing to process the enormous change that first contact represented. But the horror films proved that humanity was doing what it always did, facing the new terror, transforming it into art, and preparing itself to survive. She made her final point directly. Humanity did not create horror despite their trauma. They created it because of their trauma. The tradition existed because it worked. And through this creation, through this endless willingness to face the worst and tell stories about it, humanity had become one of the most psychologically resilient species it was possible to be. Horror was not a sign of human darkness. It was a sign of human hope. The interview concluded. Doctor thanked Doctor for her insights. The human scholar expressed hope that the information had been helpful. She mentioned that she was already planning a new course, studies, examining how humanity's horror traditions might develop in response to galactic contact. She seemed excited about the possibilities. The research team submitted their final report to Director. They recommended that human horror media be studied not as a psychological aberration, but as a unique adaptive mechanism. Humanity had evolved, or perhaps invented, a technology for metabolizing extinction-level fear. This technology had allowed them to survive scenarios that had destroyed other species. It might have applications for the broader galactic community. Director read the conclusion 3 times. The implications were significant. Humanity does not create horror art despite their trauma. They create it because of their trauma. And through this creation, they have become one of the most psychologically resilient species ever documented. They have learned to metabolize extinction. The Institute quietly began a new project. Working with human consultants, they developed carefully adapted horror experiences for non-human species facing collective crises. The first trials involved the still struggling with trauma from their ancient plague. The results were promising. Controlled exposure to fear narratives, properly structured and supported, seemed to help the process what they had spent thousands of years suppressing. The humans, for their part, continued doing what they had always done. They were already developing new nightmares, alien invasions, first contact gone wrong, parasites from beyond the stars, cosmic entities that might have noticed humanity's small blue world. Some compact species found this deeply unsettling. They wondered if humans saw all aliens as potential monsters. They worried about what the horror films suggested about human attitudes toward the galactic community. Doctor consulted again, assured them it was a good sign. When humans made horror about something, it meant they had decided that thing was worth surviving. It meant they were preparing themselves to face it. It meant they were choosing to live in a universe that contained it. The alien horror films meant that humanity had looked at the vast, strange, potentially dangerous galaxy around them, and decided it was worth surviving in. The humans were practicing, and humanity always survived what it practiced for.